You know, in the machismo game, we started with the cards face down because we didn't really know how to start face up. Okay, well, this is where you would set the first card, right? You draw the first card, have it, this is the machismo, not your assignment, but what we did in class, have it start with the card face up. You would do this in Viewdidload because here your outlets are set, so I can talk to that button. It was a single button in machismo at the time, but I'm not on screen yet. Viewdidload gets called before you come on screen. So it's a great place to do stuff like that. Viewdidload will only ever be called once in the lifetime of your controller. Period. Once. It never gets called more than once. Okay? It is a spectacularly great place to put initialization code. However, there are limits to what can go in Viewdidload, most especially geometry code. At the time Viewdidload is called, the bounds of your view is not finalized. It's probably just sitting at whatever it was in the storyboard, which may or may not be what's going to happen when it's on screen, because it might be on a little different device or a different place, or it might be rotated or something like that. So you do not want to put geometry-related code, in other words, any initialization that has to do with what the shape of your view is in Viewdidload. Okay? That's a major restriction of Viewdidload. But otherwise, it's a great place because it only gets called once before you go on screen, after your outlets get set. It's an awesome method. Okay, highly recommend it. Now, just before your view controller view appears on screen, you get Viewwillappear. Okay? This is a pretty good place to put things. It's not really as awesome as Viewdidload in some ways. And I'm not even sure I'd put geometry-related stuff in here, as you'll see in a couple of slides. However, there are some things you do want to put in here. Now, one thing you want to be careful about not putting in Viewwillappear is one-time initialization that really belongs in Viewdidload. Because, again, when you have multiple MVCs in your app, they're going to be appearing and disappearing. And so Viewwillappear is going to get called multiple times. Okay? Every time your view appears back on screen, Viewwillappear gets called again. So if it's a one-time initialization, you put it in Viewwillappear, it's going to happen every time your thing reappears. So what does go in Viewwillappear? Well, one thing is if there's some initialization you need to do based on some data that might have changed while your view controller's view was off screen. Okay? So like your model. Something changed in your model, your view controller was off screen, so it wasn't really listening for changes in the model, and then coming back on screen, oh, you better sync up with the model. Does that make sense? Because you were off screen and now you're appearing. And so this is a good thing to put in Viewwillappear, is synchronization with things that might have changed while you weren't visible, including things that, you know, were changing before you appeared for the first time, because Viewwillappear, of course, gets called the first time you appear as well. Okay, this is not Viewwillreappear, it's Viewwillappear. Okay, so that's a good thing to put in here. We'll talk later in the course about putting code in here for optimization purposes, because if you put something that's going to take a lot of resources, like you're going to make some network call in Viewdidload, and what if your MVC never appears on screen? Well, you wasted that time doing that network call in Viewdidload. Whereas if you do it in Viewwillappear, even though you're going to have to design it, because if you do something in the network, it's going to come later, it's not going to be instantaneously available, that's okay. We'll talk about how to do multi-threaded and make that all work. Kicking it off in Viewwillappear might be a little better performance because you know when you get Viewwillappear that your view is going to appear on screen. Okay, so it's worth it to do something expensive. But that's kind of advanced stuff, so don't worry about that too much for now. The view's geometry is set here. So you could do some initialization based on geometry here, and a lot of people do it because it's kind of simple, but there's actually a better place to do geometry-based initialization. But it's okay, it's quote, okay to do it in Viewwillappear, as long as you understand that your geometry could change after Viewwillappear. In other words, you can be on screen and someone could rotate the phone and now your geometry just changed. Okay, so you better deal with that. Okay, that you're not going to get Viewwillappear when you rotate, you're going to get other things. Okay, you also get notified when your view goes off screen. So that view will disappear. Okay, and what do you want to do in here? You don't usually do a lot of stuff in here. If you're doing something like animation or something, obviously this would be a good place to stop doing that, because when view will disappears happens, really you want your view controller to become a good citizen. Stop using resources. You're not on screen, stop it. Okay, you'll get Viewwillappear when you go back and you can sync back up to the world, But after you disappear, you kind of want to lay low, all right, in terms of memory usage and certainly CPU. You don't want to be using CPU. So this is a good place to do stuff like that. And to maybe remember state that you're going to restore in Viewwillappear again, whatever, kind of what you might think. There's also did versions of these. Viewdidappear and Viewdidisappear, and that happens exactly what you might think, right? Viewdidappear gets called after you're now on screen, okay? You just appeared and you just got called, okay? Same thing, Viewdidisappear, you just disappeared. Okay, now let's talk about geometry. Okay, I put this off to this slide. Your geometry in iOS 6, they introduced these really cool two methods, ViewwillLayoutSubviews and ViewdidLayoutSubviews. This is where to put geometry-related code. So ViewwillLayoutSubviews is called just before iOS 7 tries to lay out your subviews, tries to lay out your view, okay? So your geometry just changed, maybe from portrait to landscape, and there's a lot of automated stuff in iOS 7 called auto layout that will try and move everything around to fit. Now, it can't always do it, but it tries, okay? So ViewwillLayoutSubviews is called before that, and ViewdidLayoutSubviews is called after it's done that, after it's made that attempt. Okay? Now, if there's some things that have to be moved manually, you have to move them by hand, okay? There's no way to express in the automatic layout rules where things go, then best place to do it is probably in ViewdidLayoutSubviews, okay? Because the system's already laid things out. Now you can move around the last few pieces that need to be laid out. But things like buttons, you know, like that outline and unoutlined button, it's really easy to make it so that when you rotate to landscape, they move down to the corners. Okay? That's what you'd probably want there. Same thing, the text view. Pretty easy to make it widen out and get shorter when it goes to landscape. Okay? But like in Machismo, you got all those cards. When you turn it, you might want to use some logic to figure out where are you going to lay the cards out in a landscape orientation versus portrait. Okay? And you're going to have to do that next week. Okay? Not this week. So I want to talk a little more about auto-rotation. So this is the thing where you turn the phone and your geometry automatically gets changed. That automatic change to the new geometry only happens if these conditions are true. Your view controller has to return yes from should auto-rotate, which is the default. Your view controller has to return that new orientation from supported interface orientations. So that is a method that returns an enum. With landscape and portrait upside down in there. So you have to say that you support the various rotations. I believe by default it supports all rotations. And your application as a whole has to say that it supports that new orientation. Okay, and that is set. Remember when we first built our application and it ran, there was like all these kind of settings for our app that I just waved my hand and said, we'll look at this later. Well, one of the settings in there is which orientations of a device, portrait, landscape, portrait upside down, do you support? Okay, so you have to click on the ones that you support. And if you do all these things, then when the device rotates, your bounds of your view will automatically be changed and you'll get the whole ViewwillLayoutSubviews, ViewdidLayoutSubviews, auto layout, all that happening. Okay? There are also methods that get called. I put them in gray here because we're not really going to look at them. They're rarely needed. Auto layout and ViewdidLayoutSubviews are usually going to cover everything you need. But if you wanted to get involved in the animation of the rotation, all that, it's all possible, but we're not really going to look into that. Okay, in low memory situations, you're going to get this message to your view controller called did receive memory warning. Okay? And low memory doesn't necessarily mean your app is using a lot of memory. It just might be all apps on the phone combined are using a lot of the memory and it needs some of it back. And so it might be sending this to lots of applications. It's completely up to the system to decide whether it wants to generate this warning. And your only responsibility when you get this thing is to try and free up memory. Okay? That means in the heap. And that means setting strong pointers you have to nil. Okay? Now, if you display an image, okay? If your MVC's view displays an image, that's big memory. Images are a lot of memory, okay? Or it plays a sound, that's a lot of memory. But if your thing is on screen, if your view controller is on screen, you can't throw that image out. It needs to be on screen. So there's really not much you can do when you get did receive memory warning if you're on screen. Now, However, if you have an alternate image or something that's not on screen right now, you could set that to nil as long as you can recreate it. Okay? Either recreate it by getting it from the file system, even making a network call to download an image as long as the image doesn't need to be instantly available. But that's an example of how you could respond to this, especially if you're off screen, you could respond to this. Although my argument is when you go off screen and you get view did disappear or view will disappear, you should free up that stuff anyway, okay? And get it back when you do view will appear, because you don't want to be a memory pig, okay? Now, what does it matter to be a memory pig? Why do we care? Well, a couple of things. Okay, first of all, by the way, only things that use a lot of memory are things like images, video, sound. Those can use a lot of memory. Small things like little dictionaries with 5 things in them, that's using virtually no memory. I wouldn't even waste your time freeing those up. Okay, that's just going to make your code complex for nothing. So we're talking about good size things, okay, when we say free things up. But anyway, why do we want to be a good citizen here? Well, iOS has the right to kill your app if it thinks you're being a memory hog. Okay, if there's not enough memory on the system and your app happens to be using a lot of memory, it can just come along and say, bam-o, killing that baby. It's perfectly within its rights. If you're a good memory citizen, it's never going to do that. Okay? But being a good memory citizen means you shouldn't be using a lot more memory than, you know, a single MVC that's on screen right now, or if you're on the iPad, maybe it's 3 or 4 MVCs, depending on what your layout is. You know, however much memory that would be reasonable to use, a video in there, no problem, etc. That's fine. But if you have like 20 videos sitting in the heap, okay, you're going to be a candidate to get blasted. Okay? So the other thing is, you obviously want other applications to have as much memory available to them when the user switches back and forth. If you've got a reputation as a memory pig, like, oh, when I run this app, all my other apps will, you know, slow way down, oh, it's terrible. Then on the App Store, people are going to say that, and you're going to get a bad reputation. People aren't going to want your application. So that's another reason not to be a memory pig.
So does Apple check this kind of stuff to see how much memory you'd use before they would approve an app? Is that a thing?
So the question is, does Apple go and check to make sure you're being a good memory citizen before they approve you? I would say, I don't know. I don't work for Apple. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes there in terms of their approval process. My guess is if they ran your app and it just immediately ballooned up huge amount of memory, they would not approve it. That's just my guess. I mean, I wouldn't if I were them. And you know, certainly apps that are out there that have a reputation of being big memory pigs, maybe when you submit your next version or something, they're like, wait a second, did you fix that memory thing? You know what I'm saying? It's common sense. Common sense. Okay, so that's that. Okay, now I told you I would talk about creation of the view controller, and so I'm going back and talking about it here, and I'm only going to talk about it briefly because it's really not super important, because Viewdidload is where you want most of your initialization. But when your view controller is created, when it's pulled out of that storyboard and unfreeze-dried, your init method is not called. Okay, a different init method is called, the unfreeze-drying init method, which is a generic init method mechanism that we're not going to, well, we might talk about it in week 8 or 9 of this course. Not that important, but that's what Xcode uses to freeze-dry your app. So that init, you don't subclass that init. Okay, okay, it's an init. I'm not even going to tell you the name of it. You don't subclass it. Instead, when something gets unfreeze-dried from a storyboard, anything, not just your controller, but even like a button or anything else that comes out of there, this method, awake from nib, nib is an old historical name. You could think of it as awake from storyboard. This gets called, and you can put in here things that you might normally put in your init. Although again, your outlets are not set at this point, so you're better off putting stuff in Viewdidload. Okay? But if there's some reason you can't put something in Viewdidload, I can't even think of a good example why that would be, you can put things in awake from nib. Now, to make this a little more complicated, but also a little more correct, it is possible that your view controller could be created in code using alloc init. It is legal.